Have you ever looked at a world map from around the year 1900? It's almost unrecognizable. You see these massive, sprawling empires that look like they'd last forever, but then, just a couple of decades later, they're gone, wiped off the map. It was this incredible, chaotic period where the world we know today was forged. So how on earth did it happen? Let's dive in and figure it out. I mean, that's the real question, isn't it? What does it take for a giant, seemingly invincible power to just fall apart? Is it a slow rot from the inside, or is it some big, sudden shock from the outside that brings the whole thing down? Or maybe it's a mix of both. That's what we're going to dig into, the hidden patterns that connect these monumental collapses. So here's how we'll break it down. First, we'll talk about the common thread that links all these events. Then we'll dive into 4 case studies: the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, King China, and the Mexican Revolution. And at the end, we'll pull it all together and see what the big picture looks like. To really get a grip on this massive wave of change, we need a framework. Because, it was never just one single thing that toppled these giants. It was always a potent, almost perfect storm of different forces hitting all at once. And this is the best way to picture it. You've got all these internal problems, right? Things like corruption, inequality, ethnic tensions. Think of those as deep, dangerous cracks spreading through the foundation of a building. The building is still standing, but it's weak. Then along comes an external shock, a war, a new idea, foreign meddling. That's the earthquake. And boom, the whole structure comes crashing down. It's that combination, that 1-2 punch that's absolutely crucial to understanding this whole period. Okay, let's put this framework to the test with our first case study, the Ottoman Empire. Now, it had been called the sick man of Europe for a reason. It had been in a slow decline for a long time. But right around the turn of the century, a new group shows up on the scene, and they've got this wild, radical plan they think will save the whole empire. And these guys were called the Young Turks. A lot of them were educated in the West, and they came back with all these modern ideas. They looked at the empire and said, okay, to survive, we have to modernize, we have to centralize. But, and this is the really important part, they also believed they had to create one single unified Turkish identity. So in 1908, they actually pull it off. They take power. And they move fast. On the surface, their reforms look pretty progressive, They bring in elections, they secularize the laws, but underneath all that was this very forceful agenda. A big one was making Turkish the official language for everyone in this huge, diverse empire. And this is where their whole plan just backfires spectacularly. You see, the Ottoman Empire wasn't one thing. It was this incredible patchwork of different ethnicities, languages, and religions. You had Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, the list goes on. So when the Young Turks tried to force this one-size-fits-all Turkish identity on everybody, what happened? Well, they didn't just annoy people, they lit the fuse for Arab nationalism. The very thing they did to try and unite the empire was exactly what broke it apart. It's a huge irony. All right, let's jump over to Russia. The story here is a little different. It's all about this massive, super fast push to industrialize, all driven by the state. And sure, it made the country look more powerful on paper, but what it really did was create this incredibly explosive situation. A social powder keg just waiting for a spark, all under the thumb of an all-powerful czar. So you basically had the perfect recipe for a revolution. Ingredient number 1, a brand new middle class, looking at Europe and America and wanting some political power of their own. Ingredient number 2, a huge, and I mean huge, new working class living in just awful conditions and desperate for basic rights. And the final, most explosive ingredient, a czar who was completely unwilling to change or share even a tiny bit of his power. And you can see how it all just spiraled downwards. It really kicks off in 1905, when they lose a war to Japan, which was a huge shock. That triggers a revolution, and the Tsar is forced to promise reforms, but of course he goes back on his word almost immediately. Then comes the knockout blow, World War I. The empire just can't handle the strain. The whole system cracks, then shatters. And in that chaos of 1917, a small, disciplined, and pretty ruthless group, the Bolsheviks, saw their chance and grabbed power. And the result? Well, it was something that changed the entire 20th century. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, didn't just get rid of the Tsar. They created something the world had never seen before. The first communist state, the Soviet Union. The ripple effects from that moment, well, we're still dealing with them today. Okay, now for China. The fall of the Qing dynasty is maybe the most classic example of our framework, that deadly mix of rot from within and pressure from without. The dynasty was decaying internally, and at the exact same time, it was getting hammered by foreign powers. And you have to see how these things were connected. It was a total downward spiral. First, you have this absolutely devastating internal rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, which killed a staggering number of people and basically hollowed out the state. This left them way too weak to stand up to Britain in the Opium Wars. And every time they lost a war to a foreign power, it made the Qing government look weak and incompetent to their own people, which, you guessed it, just fueled more rebellion. It was a textbook vicious cycle. So when the final revolution hits in 1911, led by thinkers like Sun Yat-sen, it's so much more than just a new emperor or a new dynasty. It was the end of the line for the entire imperial system. We're talking about over 2,000 years of dynastic rule, the mandate of heaven, the whole Confucian system, gone. Just imagine the scale of that change. It's hard to even wrap your head around. So we've seen these massive, multi-ethnic empires crumble under both internal and external stress. But, not all revolutions from this period fit that exact mold. Sometimes the explosion came almost entirely from within. And that brings us to our next case, Mexico. The Mexican Revolution wasn't really about foreign invasions or managing a dozen different ethnic groups. This was a fight a nation was having with itself. It was a brutal, violent uprising against decades of staggering inequality and oppression, all presided over by one man. And this really shows you the heart of the problem. You had this dictator, Porfirio Diaz, and if you were a wealthy landowner, a foreign company, or in the military, things were great. The country looked modern and stable, but for pretty much everyone else, the peasants who'd lost their land, the workers in the mines and factories, it was a nightmare. All that progress was built on their suffering. It wasn't sustainable. It was a pressure cooker, and the lid was about to blow. So after a decade of incredibly bloody civil war, what comes out of it? The Constitution of 1917. And what's amazing about it is that it's basically a point-by-point answer to every single thing that caused the revolution. You're a landless peasant? Okay, we're doing land redistribution. You're a worker with no rights? Here are minimum wages and unions. You have no say in your government? Universal male suffrage. It was a truly radical blueprint to completely rebuild Mexican society from the ground up. All right, so we've looked at 4 really different situations, right? The Ottomans, Russia, China, Mexico. Now it's time to pull back and put all the pieces together. What's the pattern here? And this chart lays it all out perfectly. Look at the Ottoman, Russian, and Qing empires. For all 3, you see that same formula. A major internal weakness, be it nationalism, inequality, or corruption, that gets hit by a powerful external shock, like a war. And then you have Mexico, which is almost the exception that proves the rule. The internal problems, the sheer inequality, were just so extreme that the system collapsed under its own weight. So, if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's this. These huge, powerful states didn't just collapse because of one bad decision or one lost war. They fell because they were already fragile on the inside. They had these deep internal vulnerabilities that made them brittle. And when the shocks of a modernizing world finally hit, they just shattered. And that really leaves us with a fascinating question for today, doesn't it? Because this dynamic of internal weaknesses meeting external pressures, it never really goes away. It just changes form. So it makes you wonder, what are the internal cracks and external earthquakes that are reshaping the world right now? Something to think about. Thanks so much for watching.